Okay. I just wanted to start briefly, and there was a question last time about Ascophyllum and when we find the breeding receptacles on it, and I did say I'll go away, find out because I couldn't remember, and come back. The answer to that question, if you're interested, is that it is quite similar to plants actually. So they tend to produce these receptacles kind of around spring, March, April, can be as early as about now, but they can take a year to become fertile. So rather than appearing only for like a spring, it can actually be a whole year that they'll be on the seaweed until they kind of get popped off and ripen enough to be able to be functional. I think the interesting thing about Ascophyllum is that it takes about 5 years for the plant to become fertile, so it won't breed for about 5 years till after it's settled and grown. Now, the thing I want to point out about this is that if you're interested in things like, oh, I've never seen Ascophyllum have receptacles on it, I've never seen them breeding, and you're interested in timings, I can really recommend going to this website. So I'm not sure if this is one you're all familiar with. It's called the Marine Life Information Network, and it is an amazing repository of information. It has loads of stuff around distributions and habitats, links to the MBN database. So if you have any questions like that in the future, I would absolutely make that the first port of call because it's very science-based. So I can answer that question now, hopefully, but in the future, you'll have everything you need to answer your own questions. Okay, I will move on to animals now. So if you remember from Monday or have watched the video from the previous one, we were talking about how things are sorted taxonomically, and that it's broken down into domains and kingdoms, and then all the way down to the genus and species, those Latin names we were talking about. And last time we were talking about plants, touched really briefly on fungi, and then also talking about protists, which is the kingdom that contains some of the algae species. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is animals, which is obviously an enormous kingdom to talk about, so many different things in there. So I'm going to break it down into the next level, which is phyla or phylum. And there are about 36 recognized animal phyla in the world, but a lot of them you won't find in the marine environment or are very, very small and very specialized. So by my interpretation, my calculation, there are 8 that are probably important for you to know about in the marine environment. And we're just going to go through these literally alphabetically and have a look what's in each of them so you have an understanding and the kind of things you might be finding on the seashore. So, number 1, this is annelids. Again, this might be familiar to you. Annelids are worms. So these are the ringed worms or segmented worms. They're actually an incredibly large phylum. We don't tend to see most of them, but there are about well over 20,000 species in this phylum, including things like earthworms and leeches, terrestrial stuff you're probably more familiar with, but also lots of marine worms. Okay, so just talking about some of the common marine worms you might find. I'm hoping a lot of these will be familiar to you. You'll either recognize them or this will be things you've seen and might not have known what they are. So the first species I want to talk about is called Spirorbis or spiral worms. And you'll often find these on racks on rocks. Sorry, seaweed racks or rocks as in the hard things. And actually they look like they're dead, but most of them are actually alive. So they're little spiraled worms. They build their own tube like out of calcareous, like chalk essentially. They're bright orange on the inside, and what you won't see, but when they're underwater, they'll stick like tiny tentacles out of that hole and they'll just feed, like filter feed around them. So they're very common and well worth recording. They're quite difficult to record because quite often they're on species, so it becomes hard to estimate kind of numbers or distribution. Other things you've probably seen quite a lot of and may or may not have recognized as worms. These are called keel worms. So I'm talking about these, what looks almost like fossilized, again on rocks, calcareous skeletons. These are tubes that are built by the worms. Now, this is going to be my first example of possibly some kind of taxonomic argument that's happening right now. So if you are looking at the Latin name, you might see it Pomatocerus. You might also see it as Spirobranchus. I think this is the update, but there might be a bit of fighting happening right now about this. It's all very wild in the world of taxonomy. But basically, this is the same thing. It's the same species. You might see slightly different names on it. There are actually a couple of different species you might find. The main way you'll tell them apart is by little ridges either side of the main keel on the calcareous part of the tube. So I would say, again, this might be a state of, unless you're very confident and you're really keen on learning to identify the different species of keel worms, I would just put down species, or a type of species. Don't worry about what type of species it is. Functionally, it doesn't make much difference. But is that looking familiar? Something you've seen quite a lot of on the seashore? Yeah, perfect. So other things you might be seeing on the shore, and I want to mention this particularly because although we're mainly talking about intertidal recording on rocks, where you're going to find most of the species, this you'll often find in kind of mixed substrate where you've got rocks and boulders and sand, and it tends to be something that some people don't know about or don't recognize as an animal. So these are sand mason worms. Again, they are worms that are beneath the surface because worms are very vulnerable and tasty. So finding a way to survive without being eaten is pretty much the driving force behind annelids. And they build a sand tube above the surface, and that's to allow them to feed and breathe above the kind of the very surface of the sand where it gets churned up with the tide. Just put that a little bit above that. So these are actually, they can be about 30 centimeters long, about a foot long under the tube in the sand. And you'll either find them kind of individually or they'll aggregate in dense beds. And again, hopefully that's something familiar, but this is Lanis conchigla. Okay, other worms that are possible to find and include this one. So this is Linnaeus longissimus, otherwise known as the bootlace worm. Now, this is actually an entirely different phylum. There are 3 different phylums of worms. It's not important. The others only have very few that you're going to find in the marine environment. Things like, this is Nematea phylum, they're things like parasitic worms. You might find them inside you more often than in the marine environment. But the bootlace worm, so it's not a nice thought. Have you had your tea yet? The bootlace worm is one that you'll find on rocky shores. Not very frequently, but often enough that it's something we might see around the shore here in Scotland. And they're absolutely amazing if you do find one. Some people call them the ribbon worm as well. They are enormous. They can actually, I think the record is about 55 meters long for a bootlace worm. So technically, if that's the case, they are the longest animal in the world, which is quite a cool thing to have just here on the coast in Scotland. But they are very distinctive. I mean, obviously, if it's 55 meters long, it'll be very distinctive. Most of them are smaller, but when you pick them up as well, they curl a lot in your hand. They're very round and they're very slimy. They are mucus producing. So if you hold them in your hand, they will literally snot their way out of it, which is displeasing, but at least easy to identify. They are also carnivorous. That doesn't mean they're going to eat you, but they are lethal if you are a shrimp or a small fish or anything that is hanging around and tasty around the seashore. So very cool thing to look out for. Okay, that was a bit of a romp through the worms. Just a few species that you're most likely to see and most likely to identify, because a lot of worms, again, are buried in various places, so you're unlikely to see them on a rocky shore very frequently. So I'm going to move on to talk about bryozoans.
Can I just jump in quickly? Katie's asked a question related to the bootlace worm, so I thought it makes sense to quickly ask it now on her behalf.
Oh, yes, thank you. Please do. I can't see all the things going on, so let me know. What's the question?
Does the bootlace worm make a cast like a lugworm?
No, I don't think so, because lugworms are, so bootlace worms tend to live on top of the surface a lot more. Lugworms live below the surface of the sand, so they will, a cast is essentially them eating their way through the sand and taking a digestible material and pushing it back up again, whereas bootlace worms will actually essentially fish, so they're not going through the material as much. So you're more likely to find the actual worm than you are signs of it. I hope that's a reasonable answer to the question. I have lots of more interesting facts about lugworms, so ask me later and we can talk about that. Okay, so Maddie, if any other questions come up, please jump in, because I can't see them right now, so that'd be perfect. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talk about Bryozoans, and this is a phylum that tends to be unfamiliar to a lot of people. It's kind of surprising because actually there are about 5,000 species of Bryozoans in the world. So it's one of the major phyla. It's a hugely diverse group of animals, but they're very small, and we don't have ones that we particularly recognize on land. So we don't tend to they don't sit with us very well. We don't recognize them very much. But they are tiny animals, and they're also known as sea mats or sea moss. And they are tiny individuals called zooids. And each zooid essentially makes itself a tiny box to live in out of calcium carbonate, so very similar to kind of calcareous skeletons we've heard of before. And then it clones itself to form a small colony. And that's what it ends up looking like. So it might not be something you've actually recognized as a species or indeed an animal before, if you're not very familiar with rocky shores. This is why they're called sea mats. They look like a crust quite often on seaweeds, on the wracks and kelps, and they're very widespread. So here are two of the species, the common species we'd find in the UK waters. It probably looks familiar once you've thought about it. So the one on the left here is Electra pilosa, and the one on the right is Membranopora membranaceae. Now the difference, how you can tell the difference, is I like to think of it like a knitting pattern. That's essentially what they've done, if they've knitted themselves together. So for this one, for the Electra, and I don't think they have common names at all, but I'm willing to be proved wrong if people know common names for these. The Electra has kind of circular or oval knitting pattern, whereas the one on the right here has a little rectangular knitting pattern. So that's the difference between the species, and quite often these kind of the patterns of the little boxes they build, the zooids, is how you can tell species apart. And that is a dark, complex world if you want to go into learning about Bryozoa, but being able to tell those two species would be a really good start for you to do that. Again, quite difficult to record because they are an animal, they're a colony, and they tend to be on things. So it's worth turning over seaweeds and then you can spot them. Okay, so I'm working my way down alphabetically here, and I'd like to talk now about chordates. Now, chordates are the phylum that we're in. It essentially means things with a backbone. And obviously there are lots of marine species in chordates, whales, and that I'm not going to talk about. It's only focusing on things that are going to be in the intertidal. And the first of these, that again might be a surprise if you're not into taxonomy, that is in this group, are sea squirts. So these are called sea squirts or tunicates or ascidians. It's all the same name for the same type of group. And actually, so this is what they look like, this little guy here. I always think it looks a little bit like someone sucked a sweet and then just spat it out and stuck it on the seashore, something like that. It's actually a really highly evolved marine animal, theoretically with a spine. So it's in the same group as us. It's very far up like an evolutionary pathway. In fact, they've sequenced the genomes of a particular type of tunicate Ascidian, and it is the closest invertebrate relative of humans. So they don't have a full spine, obviously, like we do. They have like a false spine, but they are still the closest thing you'll find to us on the seashore, which, you know, it's not immediately obvious. In fact, the name Ascidian, the way I like to remember it, it comes from the Greek askedon, which means wine bladder. So, like, you know, the kind of thing you used to drink from. So again, I probably wouldn't drink from it, but it does remind me more of that, like the kind of sack you might have a nice Merlot or something in, rather than a kind of proto-human. Anyway, so sea squirts are amazing things, and they have a huge variety of forms that they take. So this is actually quite common type of sea squirt we'll find here, called Petrillus schlosseri. A lot of people call it the star Ascidian, which sounds nicer, I think. And that is, again, it looks a little bit like a mat. It often grows on seaweeds, but it is an animal. And it's very distinctive because it looks like tiny flowers or tiny stars, often quite kind of glowingly white or blue, very beautiful. Amazing thing to find if you're on a seashore, especially if you're taking out kids or, you know, trying to excite people about the seashore, because it's one of the few things that I think looks genuinely beautiful, rather than like weird squishy alien gunk, which is largely what I'm exciting children with when we get on the seashore. So that's quite a nice one because it's relatively easy to identify. And then other sea squirts, there are quite a lot around here. Most of them are relatively difficult to identify. So this is one we found not that long ago. I think it is a type of Acidiella. Now that is, there are a few different species it could be. I think it's probably something called Acidelia scabra, otherwise known as the hairy sea squirt, which it's not actually hairy, but it looks kind of bumpy, I guess, on the surface. Has a kind of reddish tinge to it. But again, this is an example of, you know, they're very difficult to identify. If you're not sure, just put it to genus level. Don't worry about putting down the species, because a lot of these things take quite a lot of experience and going out on the seashore and you know, having it confirmed to understand what it is. So it's kind of better to just lift it up a level where you're certain that's what it is. Another type of sea squirt you might find is Dendrodoa grossularia. Now that is fun to say, to be fair, but it's otherwise known as, I think, the baked bean sea squirt. I'm a bit suspicious about that one. It's not the first thing that comes to mind for me, but they're kind of bright red, squidgy looking. They have two, so they have siphons. So sea squirts basically bring water in and then bring water out again and eat anything that gets stuck in the middle. So they've got two very obvious siphons, these ones. And I think if you see that colour in those siphons, it's probably this particular species, and that's something you can record. The trouble with sea squirts is they tend to change shape depending on whether they're on their own or whether they're in groups. So it can be quite difficult just from the shape to be able to tell what they are. And then I appreciate what seems like a jump. I'm going to move on seamlessly from sea squirts to fish. Now, they may seem hugely different, but of course they're actually in the same phylum. They're all part of that same group. They just have taken very different approaches evolutionarily to life. So we don't see huge numbers of fish on the rocky shore. You might see some in rock pools, but actually some manage to survive quite well in the intertidal, either as nursery species or just that's the place they live. So if you're lucky and you're looking under rocks and then overhangs and rock pools, you might find a reasonable number of rock pool fish. So this is one of my favourites, Pterulus barbalus, otherwise known as a long-spined sea scorpion. You can get a regular sea scorpion as well. And the way you can really tell it's a sea scorpion is they have what look like evil villain moustaches, I like to think of it as. So they've got very like stuck out barbels either side of the mouth. Someone would describe them to me as looking like lumpy armoured cars, like the kind of thing you drive in to deal with a terrorist situation. they're quite distinctive because they're so wide and flat with those little spines and barbels. They're very good rocky shore species. They don't have swim bladders like a lot of fish, so they can't really swim, control their movement in water in the same way as others. So they float when they swim and they sink when they stop, and they spend a lot of time just hiding on the rocky shore, stuck under things. So they're quite a good thing to find. Other species you might spot. This one is quite obvious. I imagine most people have found this at some point. This is a butterfish, or Pholus ganellus. And you can tell it's a butterfish because it's very long and has these big spots on the back that are supposed to look like eyes. So the kind of things that kind of deter predators. And again, these are another one that they're quite mucousy. There's a lot of mucus on the seashore. And if you pick them up, they'll pretty much disappear out of your hand immediately. As soon as you grab them, they're gone. So, I mean, that's why they're called butterfish, less because they're tasty and more because you're just going to drop them very quickly. Fish that start to get a little bit harder to identify, rock gobies, so Gobius paganellus. This is probably the most common fish species you'll find on a rocky shore. And the way that I would identify it is they look kind of yellowy. They've got a slightly goldy yellowy tinge to them, and they have two dorsal fins. So in this picture, you can see that there's a back fin here, and then a break, and then another back fin. And that's quite distinctive. A lot of other species won't have that on the shore. They're quite cool as well. Their pelvic fins have little suckers. So they are adapted to be on the rocky shore. They literally suck onto rocks to stop it being swept away by waves. So they like being in that kind of intertidal environment. They're very well adapted to it. And the final fish that you're probably going to find that is relatively easy to identify is the blenny. Now, there are a couple of different species of blenny, but by far the most common is the common blenny. Not always the case that the common something is the most common, so enjoy this one while it's there. And this one I always recognise because I think it looks kind of moody. It's got quite fat lips. It looks quite sad the whole time, and it has one dorsal fin. So compared to the previous one, the goby, this just has one back fin and very big lips. I would say that in a lot of ways, fish are some of your hardest things to identify because unless you manage to catch them, which is challenging, they tend to be quite quickly gone. So much easier to identify snails that aren't moving anywhere fast. So if you do manage to catch one, obviously, keep it in a bucket of water. Fish not largely happy out of water, as the metaphor goes. But if you can take photos of the top, the side, and the underneath, and from the front and back, it will really help. So rather than just taking one, because so much of the identification is around facial features and different types of fin, take pictures of all of them, and that will really help your identification later on. Okay, I'm going to move on. I did promise you this was going to be a romp through rocky shore species, so do just ask any questions if you have them, or we can save them to the end. So the next one I want to talk about are called Cnidaria. I don't know why there's a C at the beginning. Silent C, just to make it even more confusing. Now, Cnidaria are actually a huge phylum, only a few of which live on rocky shores. Most of them are very marine, and that's because they include things like jellyfish. Does anyone recognise this? Anyone seen this on their shores? Out of interest, it's not supposed to be on the shore. So,
is it a lion's mane?
It is. Yes, lion's mane jellyfish. Absolutely right. Obviously, not happy if it's on the shore like this. So, like all intertidal recording, I wouldn't be recording dead species. I'd be recording live species. However, there are some exceptions that include things like, I don't know, if a sperm whale gets washed up on your shore, I'd maybe mention it to somebody. But also particularly jellyfish, because there are monitoring systems around jellyfish mass strandings. The Marine Conservation Society has like a jellyfish watch. So if you see things that, large scale mass strandings, there are places that are interested in that and following where that happens. So I'm happy to provide more details if that's the case. So the most obvious Cnidaria you'll see on the rocky shore are actually the anemones. So they're very closely related to jellyfish, and that is because they all have these stinging tentacles. So unlike poisonous or venomous species, these tentacles are actually, they're stinging because they have tiny cells that fire out barbs when they're attacked. So it's not a chemical, it's an actual physical reaction, which means that things like jellyfish, even when they're dead, can still hurt you because the cells will still just automatically fire even if they're dead. So don't touch jellyfish at any point is largely the lesson there. I did one of my favorite stories I ever tell people when I'm training is that I take out students a lot, undergraduate students, and teach them rocky shores. And I once said to a student, this actually be quite painful, you know, if you touch a jellyfish. If you touch an anemone, because they're so small, it probably won't make a big difference. You can kind of feel it sticking, but it won't hurt. And he said, what would happen if I licked it instead? And I said, I don't know. And so he did. And it turns out the answer to that question is, yes, it does hurt if you lick an anemone. So someone else has done that experiment. Feel free to not do it. And don't ask whether he got his degree, would be the other question. Okay, so yes, it does hurt. But basically, anemones are quite simple little creatures, like a lot of things on the rocky shore. They're basically a mouth that they, in the middle of these tentacles, that they shove things in. So most anemones are, again, fisher types. They're carnivorous. They'll take things that float past. Quite a lot of them will grab tiny fish if they go past, grab hold of it and then just shove it inside, and then close over and dissolve it into food. So if you see an anemone in the water that looks very lumpy and has its tentacles in, it's because it's just had a big lunch and doesn't want to come out. Most of the time underwater, you'll see the tentacles. When they're out of the water, they'll retract them in just to maintain their kind of water, to stop them losing water, essentially. So common anemones, absolutely the most common on our shores is the beadlet anemone, Actinia equina. It's called a beadlet anemone because it has these tiny blue beads. You can see them there around the outside. They're actually a different type of stinging cell. So beadlet anemones look beautiful, are actually really vicious. They like attacking each other quite a lot. They like fighting for space. Anemones can actually move away from each other. It looks like they're stuck, but they can kind of, it's called blebbing. They kind of walk over the rocky shore in a displeasing fashion. So they like to fight each other. That is distinctive of the beadlet anemone, but quite often you won't get to see those beads because it'll be tucked in. But any kind of reddish, orange, greenish, small anemone on the shore is most likely this species. I added this picture because this is something that happened to me in the lab not that long ago. An anemone basically spat out baby anemones when we brought it inside. So they just store them all inside, and then when they're ready to go, they just spit them out into the water and let them go, and then they just suck on and start their own lives. It's actually, it's one of the nicest ways of breeding. I could do an entire talk about horrible ways that sea things breed, but maybe next training. I don't know. Okay, so other types of anemone you might find less common, but really cool if you find them. So this is a dahlia anemone. When you see it out, the tentacles are amazing. They're quite often striped. They're white and pink and yellow and really beautiful. Again, because you're looking on shores when there's unlikely to be water there, or hopefully you're on shores when the water isn't there, you're more likely to see them tucked in. So the way you can tell it's a dahlia anemone when it's tucked in is that it likes to stick things to itself. There's more snot happening in this story, but it does it as a protective mechanism to hide itself. So if you see an anemone with lots of bits of rock stuck to it, it's intentional, it's done it to itself, and it's probably a dahlia anemone. The other main one you're going to see is Anemone viridis. So viridis is means green, and that's otherwise known as a snake locks anemone. So this one doesn't retract; it just stays out all the time. It quite often just hangs in the water, and it's mainly in the lower shore. You won't find it high up because it can't retract, so it can't keep hold of that water. But they're very obvious when you see them. Huge, brown, green, often green with like little purpley tinges. And we'll have a look at one a bit later. Okay, possibly some more familiar phyla happening now, crustaceans. Now, crustaceans includes crabs, which is the first thing that most people think of. I'm going to talk about crabs, but it also includes barnacles. Very similar species, it's just barnacles have lost all the appendages and have made themselves as simple as possible. But they come from the same evolutionary pathway. Now, I'm not really going to talk about barnacles because barnacle ID is a dark art. I'm happy to talk about it. There are 4, 5 if you count an invasive species in the UK. If you want to get into barnacle ID, you need a hand lens and a lot of patience, and I'm happy to talk through it. But largely for your purposes, it probably won't be necessary. Again, if you're interested in seeing which species you have, great. If not, record them as barnacle. That's absolutely fine. So the main thing I like to see in the crustacea group is crab. And this is a slight aside taxonomically, but there's been quite a lot. If you're interested in following these kind of stories, there's been quite a lot of chat in the press over the past kind of 10 years or so about crabs, because increasing taxonomic studies come out to show that crabs have evolved from different taxonomic pathways more frequently than any other body form we've ever found. So it's now, there's all these kind of memes that have appeared if you're into social media or the kind of the meme culture at the moment, because it is something that's become hugely popular. So there's a joke basically that eventually everything will turn into a crab. Now, the process is called carcinization. That's basically the fact that things will evolve independently to look like a crab. Essentially, evolution seems to think that crab is the ideal endpoint for everything to look like. And when you look at them, they're basically half weapon. So it's probably not a bad body plan when you think about it. Ultimately, we're not 100% sure why crab is the ideal, but there's more research to be done. I'll get back to you if anything exciting comes out about that. So, types of crab that you're going to find on the rocky shore. Most common, probably very familiar to you, is the crab you'd see kids picking up quite often, the green or common shore crab. So it's greeny, it's quite small quite often. The key identifying feature, if you're uncertain, is that it has 5 points, these little bits here, either side of the eyes on the carapace. So it should have 3 little bumps in the middle with the eyes and then 5 either side. And that tells you that it's Carcinus manus, the common shore crab. This is just a little point. There are some other species of crab, and in fact, there are invasive species coming in that people have concerns about. Some of the pictures of the invasive species look quite a lot like young shore crabs. So these are young crabs. This is a young edible crab. This is a young shore crab. So you can see it's got that very distinctive like brown and white pattern because it hasn't formed the shell yet. This isn't a different species. This is just a baby version. So quite often, you won't see that in books, that kind of development phase. It's worth just knowing what that looks like so it doesn't confuse you utterly if you find it on the shore and think it's invasive. And then the one we were talking about last week, or Monday, sorry, I've lost track of time already, the edible crab or the pie crust crab. They are amazingly well camouflaged, actually, when you see them among rocks. So Cancerpagoras, it's the one you'd see on restaurant plates. So it's probably the most familiar, although probably not this size. They tend to be small when they're on the rocky shore, and then they'll grow and they'll migrate out to deeper waters. And then the other one, again, great for kids, is the hermit crab, Pagoras bernhartus. So these are amazingly common on the rocky shore. It's worth noting that in some places they're almost more common than the shells. So if you are recording species, if you're interested in recording things like numbers of limpets, for example, you need to be careful and make sure you turn most of them over, that they are actually live limpets and not just hermit crabs. There are some places on the East Coast, I'm thinking of North Berwick particularly, that's awful for that. It looks like huge amounts of winkles on a shore, and as soon as you go there, you realize there's about 4,000 hermit crabs. Amazing. Absolutely amazing how well they've taken over that bit of shore. But I think there's an interest there in how that balance differs across different places. So it's well worth turning things over and finding out. And I put a question mark here because there is a crab in this picture. And it's this shape here. I'm hoping you can see it. If you're on a small screen, you might not be able to. This is a spider crab. I don't know which species this is because this photo was sent to me and I didn't have a chance to look at it. Spider crabs are amazing. They tend to cover themselves in stuff to hide on a rocky shore. It's just to highlight that quite often these things are so well camouflaged that it's very difficult to spot them. So you need to kind of get your eye in, but also, you know, these kind of photos are great, but it's very difficult to tell species from that. So again, the more distinctive points you can get of a photo of a species, the more likely it is that later on we'll be able to identify it. Don't ever feel like taking a photo from all angles is going to be wasted, because it's really not. Okay, the next group are the Echinoderms, and these are basically the spiky ones. So echinus comes from kind of the word hedgehog, the same root as hedgehog, so spiky essentially, and it includes things like the starfish. So very simple body plans, and have developed defenses against being eaten. So the most common one you like to see is the common starfish. They're still not surprisingly very common, and that's because starfish are a top predator on the rocky shore. So if you've spent any time with me before, I'll probably have sent you a video of a starfish eating mussels. It's horrendous. It's like a horror film. They take the stomach from inside themselves, shove it into the nearest crack, and dissolve things from the inside out. Okay, it is literally everyone's worst nightmare. But they are incredibly important on the rocky shore because they determine the balance of other species. They're the things that wander around. They're a bit like having wolves in an environment. You know, that's what eats everything else. They are intertidal. They tend to prefer lower depths, but they will come into the intertidal, particularly around things like mussel beds, which is their favorite food. Now, the other type of starfish you're most likely to find is Henricea oculata, otherwise known as the bloody Henry starfish. Now, that is because it looks very pinky purpley, and it quite often has what looks like blood patches on it. It's not, it's just markings, but they're quite obvious when you find them, particularly if you touch them or pick them up, because they're very rigid compared to common starfish that are quite squishy. These guys feel very hard. And then other types of starfish, this is the common sun star. It's amazing how difficult that is to spot for something that's enormous and bright pink on the seashore, but quite often it is well hidden under things, as you can imagine. It tends to have 10 to 12 arms compared to the 5 to 6 arms of a starfish, common starfish. Very bright colours, fantastic if you can find them. And then things like sea urchins. So this is Echinus esculentus, the edible sea urchin, if you fancy it, or the common sea urchin. Oh, obviously not a hermit crab. Sorry. And then, of course, the brittle stars. So again, far more common out in the depths, like when you see them over kind of subtidal beds, there can be millions of them out there, but we do find them in intertidal habitats as well, particularly kind of under boulders and on coarse sediments. You might find quite a lot of brittle stars. Okay, Now, I'm going to move on to mollusks. This is the biggest group, and I'm not going to lie, the one I'm most excited about. So everything else was basically just a precursor to me talking about snails for the next 15 minutes. If you're not excited by mollusks, why not? And hopefully by the end I can get you interested in mollusk ID. So mollusks are pretty much the biggest intertidal phyla. About 25% of all marine species are actually mollusk. So, you know, if you're looking at the whole ocean, incredibly difficult thing to identify. And it includes things like octopus, which obviously we're not going to talk about for intertidal. If they're in intertidal, they're in trouble. But also things like sea slugs. So this is a sea slug here. Again, we don't see many on the intertidal. They're mainly subtidal. I know that subtidal training is available. It's happening over the next month or so, a few weeks. So if you're interested in talking more about things like sea slugs, absolutely go to that training. I think it would be fantastic to talk more about them. But for now, I'm mainly going to talk about the types of sea snails, so the hard mollusks. And that's because obviously the intertidal is a difficult environment to live in. You're mainly being battered by the tide, you're being dried out. And so those with the hard shells are the ones that are more likely to survive and thrive in this kind of environment. So one you might see, particularly if you turn over rocks, are chitons, these guys here. These are kind of, always think they look a little bit like woodlice, or like trilobites. If you're into fossils, these are basically the modern day antecedents of trilobites. Now, there are about 12 species or so in the UK. They're all kind of grey, browny, mottly. So I wouldn't try and identify them. Without turning them over, without taking them out to a lab, I think they're incredibly difficult to identify on the seashore. So I think noting down chiton is absolutely fine for these species, again, unless it's something you want to get into. Most of these, you need some kind of specialization to do it. Okay, things you will see on the seashore are limpets, and everywhere, obviously. So everyone will have seen a common limpet. It's called Patella vulgata. Patella like the kneecap, because it looks a bit like this, the same kind of rounded kneecap comes from the same root. They're called common limpets for a reason. They are everywhere. Now, the one thing I would say is that there are other species of limpets. They're very difficult to tell apart unless you turn them over and look at them. And if you've ever tried to prize a limpet off a rock, you'll know that turning them over is not an easy thing to do. So I would record everything as a common limpet, as Patella vulgata, unless you have a clear understanding that something else is there. I don't know why I'm on a kind of, I clearly haven't had my tea, so I'm thinking about eating things, but my favorite fact about limpets is that they have tongues that lick rock. So it's called a radula, and they use it basically to scrape algae off rock. So quite often you can see patterns on a seashore that involves little kind of zigzaggy clearances of the algae, which is pretty much always limpets that are clearing the algae. So they're called radula, and they're amazingly hard, the tongues they've developed. So much so that people are trying to use it as like a biomimicry material. They're trying to make like armored plates of tanks out of this stuff because it's so hard. Now, one of my favorite facts is that during the war, particularly down in the Channel Islands, when there was a lot of hunger, they were occupied, people started eating limpets, which I think is definitely a form of desperation because they're not the tastiest and they're quite difficult to get off the rock. But after the war, they found out huge numbers of people had to go to the doctor because if you eat limpets, you also eat the radula, you eat the tongue. You wouldn't notice it, but you can't dissolve them. Your stomach acid won't dissolve it. It's too hard. And if you eat enough limpets, they basically get tangled up in your stomach and form a ball, like a hairball, but made of limpet tongue. So people had to go to the doctor and have it removed surgically because it was impossible to digest in the stomach. That's how hard that stuff is. Anyway, that's an aside, but basically don't lick anemones, don't eat lots of limpets are the takeaway messages from this evening. Cool. So other species of limpets, much smaller, much harder to eat. Actually, one of my favorite species on the rocky shore is the tortoiseshell limpet, Testinalia testinalis, which is fun to say as well. And they are absolutely tiny. So this photo shows you the normal size of a tortoiseshell limpet. And this is my cue to say that quite often, if you're looking at pictures in books, that's absolutely great. But because they're trying to show you the biggest detail, they give you a false impression of how large something is. So it's well worth checking. I know it sounds like an obvious thing, but it'll often give you a size, range in books. It's well worth checking that, because a tortoiseshell limpet will never get as big as a common limpet. It's a completely different size metric. So it just gives you that little bit more information about understanding what the species is. I mean, it's called a tortoiseshell limpet because it's got that very tortoiseshell pattern at the top. And then the other amazing limpet that you don't get to see very often, because it tends to be down the lower shore, is Patella pellucida, which is the blue rayed limpet. Now this is awesome because it's neon. It has these rays on it. It essentially glows under UV light, or under bright sunlight. Now, I think of them as like disco limpets, but you won't see them very often because most of the time they're very much low down on the shore. You might find them on kelp fronds. And particularly, you find them in the holdfasts of kelp. So this is kelp that's been uprooted by the tide. And these are the limpets. There you go. There's one there and one there that were living inside it. So if you want to find them, again, that's a really good place to look. They're like little nursery tents, the holdfasts of kelp. Lots of things are living in there when they're particularly vulnerable. And then some of my favorites are the winkles. And associated species. So these are the proper sea snails, the ones that look like snails. And the important thing is you can get really geeky about, if you're that type of person, you can get really geeky about identifying sea snails. And the main things you need to know to identify them are to look at the underside, because these shapes under here are what are going to tell you the species are. So that includes what's called the aperture, so the hole, essentially. The spire, so the top bit of the snail, and the word you'll see quite frequently is operculum. Now that is a tiny trapdoor that attaches to the bottom of the foot. And essentially when they're out of the water, they'll just pull that shut to keep the water in. So much stuff is basically trying to keep water in when they're out of the tide. So the shape of all these things are what are going to tell you these species are different. So this species here is called the dog whelk, Nucilla lapillus. Probably very familiar to everybody. I thought this was a nice picture because this is it actually laying eggs. So if you see these on the seashore, this is what dog whelk eggs look like. Now, the way you can tell it's a dog whelk is, like everything else, by turning it over. They're white. Most of the species aren't white, so that is obvious. But it also has this siphonal canal. So it has like a little hole out of the back of the shell. Now that is because dog whelks are predators. Very similar to starfish, they like eating, particularly mussels actually. And they eat mussels by holding on and using their radula to drill through the shell. It can take them apparently about 2 days to get through an adult thick mussel just by drilling and grinding a hole through the shell. And then they just eat it like the flesh from the inside out. So this little hole is there because when they're stuck on for 2 hours to 2 days, they're using that to exchange gas and water. So that is basically the mark of a predator on the rocky shore, and how you'll tell them apart from some of the other species. Because most of the mollusks are much gentler. They are the cows of the seashore. They spend most of their time wandering around, licking algae off rocks, grazing on seaweeds, very gentle little animals. The most common is the common periwinkle, Littorina littorea, the one you'll probably see absolutely most of. However, there is a very similar species called Littorina saxatilis, or the rough periwinkle. Now these are as you can see from these images, very similar looking. They're both kind of like whitey, grey, browny coloured on the top. They're both a similar kind of size. Now, the way you can tell them apart is by looking underneath. And you may or may not want to know this much detail about winkles, but I think it's interesting to show the kind of definition of how we identify species. So the way I like to think of it is that basically the rough periwinkle, which is this one here, is the like the Jennifer Lopez of the rocky shore, in that it has a much bigger butt and a sulky lip at the bottom. So you can see it's got a much bigger hole that kind of drops down below, and it's got a rim here, whereas this one doesn't. It's a much smaller hole and doesn't have the same kind of rim. You can use your own imagination as to why these two are different. So other snail species you'll find are the flat periwinkles, or the common flat periwinkles. Now, there are actually two species of these. That's getting some really deep winkle ID. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk it through. I appreciate I might be pushing people's interest in snails to the limit here, so we'll move on. But just to point out that the colour is not how you tell them apart. So these are the same species of flat periwinkle. These are the ones that kind of look like air bladders. They're designed to look like air bladders on the shore. So they'll be attached to seaweeds. They'll mimic air bladders, and the colour will depend on whereabouts on the shore they are. So it's not to do with the species, it's to do with their adaptation to where they were born, actually. And just for interest, this is what flat periwinkle eggs look like. These little egg sacs on here. So quite a lot of the snail species particularly will lay eggs, and things you can find quite often in the spring worth looking out for. Okay, other mollusks. The top shell species, I think these are amazing because they're such great colours. This is a purple top shell, or Gibula umbilicalis. Now, there are actually two very common, quite similar species you'll find on your seashore. Gibula umbilicalis, which is the purple top shell, and Staurophila cineraria, which is the grey top shell. So this one is purplier. This one is greyer, but that is quite a tough call unless you're holding them together. So the way you'll tell these apart is this one has a bigger hole in the middle. Again, that's a bit of a judgment call. And it has kind of wider pinstripes. So this one's wearing like a bit more of a fancy suit, essentially. So these are the kind of things that's much easier to tell if you pick them up and compare them and you start to find different things on your shore. Very difficult to tell just from a photo unless you've got your eye in. And particularly, they can be different on different shores. So getting to know your local shore is probably the best way to get familiar with these species. And then absolutely the one you can't mistake is Calliostoma zizophynium, which is also really fun to say. So if you're going to learn any Latin name, learn this one. That's the painted top shell. It's pink, it's silver, it's stripy, it's enormous. You'll mainly find it on the lower shore, and it's one of the favourite things to find because it's so ridiculous. There's no reason for it to be. I spend a lot of time telling people about how everything's beautifully adapted and camouflaged on the rocky shore, and this enormous bright pink and silver shell wanders out and completely disproves all our theories. Okay, I'm aware I want to give you time to have a look at some pictures and share some ideas yourself. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about porifera, or as otherwise known, sponges. Most sponges are deep sea or subtidal. Very few sponges will survive intertidally, and that's because they just don't have much adaptation to live in these environments. But we'll get a couple that you might be able to identify. So this one is called crumb of bread sponge. That's apparently the common name. You can probably tell it because it's very bright orange. It sticks under rock overhangs, things like that. Good luck if you want to try and say the Latin name. I will definitely give you points if you give it a go later on this evening. And the other one you'll probably be able to spot is called breadcrumb sponge. Now that is different to crumb of bread sponge. I don't know who named these. Someone that was obsessed with carbohydrates and had some really off bread in their house, apparently. the idea is it looks a bit like a crust, I think. But this one particularly has, you can see the holes of the sponge. You can see what are called the oscula. So these are like, they're like tiny volcanoes to me. And this is kind of greeny yellow, again, will be encrusting on the seashore. So those are the two you're most likely to find on the seashore before you get to the subtidal. Okay, that is my romp through marine phyla. Does anyone have any questions that I missed in the chat, or they'd like to say, or comments, or things that they feel I've missed that they are particularly excited by? Did that all make sense? Some thumbs up. Okay, great. So a bit like last time, what I'm going to suggest we do is go into, oh, I will stop sharing my screen now. Go into breakout groups again. I think it'd be really nice to have a chance to share what's obviously a lot of expertise in this group, and have a look at some pictures. So I'm going to pop this link in the chat again, and then pop you in breakout groups if that's okay. And again, just take some time to have a look at the pictures that are in this folder. These are different pictures to last time's. There's 20 because I think you'll be better at animals than at seaweeds, but again, have a look at them, see what you kind of fancy, and just share your knowledge about it. I think that would be fantastic, and then we'll come back and have a chat. So I'm going to pop you in now. Take the link and open the drive if you can. So I know that wasn't very long to have to rapidly identify everything, but hopefully it just gave you a chance for a little bit of discussion and to talk through some of these ideas. Dave, you said there were a couple of questions. I thought, again, we could just go through and then make this a bit of an open floor, and we can bring out any questions in the whole room, if that's okay. So again, now is very much the point where you can just jump in whenever you want, but I will share my screen again so we can hopefully see the pictures. Are they coming up for you?
Yep.
Hopefully they're the right pictures that you're looking at as well, otherwise this is going to be really rapid. So species 1.
Beadlets, anemone.
Yeah, a nice easy start, hopefully. But I thought this was quite a useful picture because you can see the beads on this one, obviously the tentacles, and then what it looks like when it's not out in the water. So gives you the full range of identification. Species 2.
Dogwell.
Dogwell, yeah, that's that siphonal canal very obviously being shown there. Always nice to see a photo of the underside of a mollusk, I think is really helpful. This one.
Butterfish.
Butterfish, yeah, very distinctive eye markings, even if you can't see the rest of it.
Yeah, it was dead. Sorry, that's why it's not in water properly. It's one we collected.
Oh, these are your photos?
I
Fabulous.
think so. I didn't realize my anemone one was so good, actually. I didn't look at it properly before.
Well, I'm glad I said it was such a good photo then, otherwise. Fantastic. Well, in which case you can definitely talk us through the rest of them, can't you?
No. That's why I was so good at identifying them. I didn't know if they were mine. I couldn't see them when we were doing the thing.
Oh, well, there you go. I feel like you're like a plant in this session now. Okay, any offers on species 4?
Spirorbis.
Spirorbis, yes, spiral worms. Perfect. Number 5?
Oh, it's not mine.
Flat periwinkle.
Yeah, common flat periwinkle. Probably a little rhino obtusata, so the I said I can tell you have to tell the two of them apart, but from this it looks like the common flat periwinkle. Lovely colours. They do come in these kind of yellow and red tiger stripes, which I always find, again, not quite sure what adaptation that's for, but
what's like briefly the way to tell between the two, or generally what's the difference
between the two flat periwinkles?
Yeah.
Again, it's if you turn them over, so you're looking at the underside and the operculum and the spire, and one of them is very much, the operculum is very much more teardrop shaped, so it hangs down below the body of the snail, and the other one's much tighter in. If you're interested, I can put photos up, send you photos later of the two of them. Part of the reason I didn't differentiate is there's actually, it seems to be a bit of confusion between different textbooks on which one's which. So although people are confident how to tell them apart, the name of each of them is actually under some argument. So I wouldn't recommend necessarily trying to do that at the moment, but it's interesting and just in terms of ID, if not actually being able to accurately record them. Okay, species 6.
Common periwinkle?
Yeah, common periwinkle. It's quite a little photo, but sometimes that's where you see this is a bit more of a kind of person's eye view of this, isn't it? Yeah, common periwinkles here on the right, that kind of characteristic blacky grey colour. And 7.
Common starfish.
Starfish.
Yeah, we could do that as like a rousing chorus if you want. 8.
Purple?
Possibly purple top shell.
Yeah, it's the purple top shell, so that's a Gibula umbilicalis. You can see the purpley broader stripes, but obviously it's quite worn, and that's typically what you'll find it's very the surface of it's battered, and that's because it's kind of nacre, so mother of pearl is what the shell's made of, and it actually puts like a soft velvety type skin on top, which makes the color, which gets rubbed off very easily. As soon as they die, that skin goes as well, so you're just left with that mother of pearl. So this is kind of like actual ID in the fields that you'll be faced with. There's just these little kind of clues left over. Cool, this one.
Keel worms.
Keel worms, yeah, that Spirobranchus promatocerus, who knows? And then
A little question.
Yeah,
so a question on these. Is it sepulid worms that make the reefs?
Yes.
Are these the same things?
They're related, but
Right.
not the same species.
Okay.
Yeah. This guy.
Snake
Snake
locks.
locks.
Yeah, that's a snake locks. Quite different to the photo I showed you. This is the green version with the purple tips. So snake locks anemones have a symbiotic relationship with an alga. So if they are sited in an area that gets some sunlight, they tend to be green because they'll have the kind of chlorophyll as part of them. If they're in a shady area, the algae doesn't want to know, and so they tend to be that kind of natural browny color. So sometimes it's interesting, tells you whereabouts they are.
Do you get any shrimps that live with them? The snake locks.
Yes, you can get.
Because you often see with these coral seas and stuff like that, with anemones, they often have shrimps or small crustacea with them. Well, no, shrimps are crustacea, aren't they? I'm learning.
Yeah, so these actually do have some species that use them for protection because they are quite big and they never go in. So they are an anemone species that has that.
Right.
Anemones seem to be a species that form a lot of symbiotic relationships. I'm not quite sure why. I think that stinging potential is very useful for a lot of species. So you'll also see like anemone crabs that hold onto them, like pom-pom crabs that use them like little boxing gloves, essentially. But most of those are in the deeper waters. We don't see that so much in the intertidal. Cool, this one, which is not one I told you about.
That looks like a necra. Yeah.
Oh, was that a
Sorry.
no, that was good. That was a so it's a Nacora puba, so the devil eye crab or the velvet swimming crab. Don't get it much in the intertidal unless you get some kind of quite shallow intertidal, essentially, if you get some remaining water. But you can find them, and they are very distinctive. They're the kind of things that most people would be able to recognize very quickly if you knew it, because of these back legs. So they're swimming legs, actually paddles at the back. They're called devil crabs mainly because they're really vicious. So they're the kind of thing that I would not recommend picking up. There are a lot of undergraduates that tend to have tips of fingers nicely removed as they try and pick up one of these guys. So also apparently quite scary, because if you're snorkeling, because they can swim, they swim towards you, and all you see is these little red glowing eyes appear out of the seaweed. So it's enough to put you off. I'm getting trickier now. Any idea on this one?
These are the Beyonce snails.
Yes, thank you for remembering that. That's it. Yes, so these are the rough periwinkles, the Littorina saxatilis, and along with the Beyonce bottoms, they've also got very kind of pronounced ridges of the spires, which is how you can tell from this angle that they're the rough periwinkles, most obviously. So yeah, great job. This one.
Common shore crab.
Yeah, this is a nice photo of a recognizable species, hopefully. And again, you can see that kind of 5 prongs either side of the eyes. Any offers?
We thought it was a limpet, but it's not on a rock, so we were wondering if it's a limpet or not.
Yeah, it wasn't supposed to be quite a difficult question, but yes, it is a limpet, but it's clearly not living. So a limpet would actually be on a hard rock substrate, not on the sand. So this is the kind of thing that if you turn it over, you'd very quickly find out it wasn't living. But in a photo, you might be having questions about what kind of species that is or where it is. And partly the reason it's quite difficult to tell it's a limpet is because it's been dead for a little while. It's lost a lot of it's been kind of rubbed by the sand and lost a lot of the markings on the shell. So again, it's more just a little warning about making sure what you're recording is alive, or if it's not alive, that you're recording it appropriately is not alive, rather than it being part of that. And particularly with shells, because they do have a tendency to distribute quite far from the place where the actual live animals are. So there's a lot of there's a really interesting book that looks at how shells are taken by the tide and how it distributes them different places. So sometimes you can get shells that curl to the left or shells that curl to the right, and they'll end up on different parts of the beach. Or if you get mussel shells that separate, the left one will be kind of left shell will be on one side of the beach and the right shell will be on the other, just because of the way they catch the tide. It's going to demonstrate how much the tide affects where things are found. So it's while it's interesting to find these things, it tells you very little about where it's actually come from. There's also a really interesting experiment. Anyone see it about Nike trainers that were dropped off a container ship about 20 years ago? Thousands, tens of thousands of Nike trainers fell off a container ship that crashed, and they all went into the sea, which is awful. But it formed a natural experiment because all the left trainers went to one country and all the right trainers went to another country because they got taken by the wind and the tide because they're different shapes. There was actually, for a good number of years, not sure if it's still going, a website where owners of left trainers would swap with owners of right trainers to form pairs across different countries. It's a very beautiful cultural exchange. Sorry, nothing to do with Intertidal, but I like these kind of things. Right, species 16.
The star Ascidian.
Yeah, great answer. Very different looking from the ones I showed you, maybe, but this is Batrella schlosseri, the star Ascidian. So these little animals that are living as a kind of mat.
Is that not the sponge? Is that different?
So this here is the star Ascidian, is the tunicate. I think there might be, it looks like there's another tunicate there, and I'm not sure if it's some kind of sponge. And so there's other stuff going on there, but the bit I was focusing on was this, with these, yeah, these Ascidians, these sea squirts. This one.
One of the sea mats.
Yeah, great answer. One of the sea mats is really reasonable. Yeah, absolutely. I would call this one, again, I put the PDF in there, so this is not a memory test. You can totally take all this away with you, but this is Electra pilosa, so it's the one with slightly more rounded knitting compartments, I guess. But yeah, a bryozoan, a sea mat's totally fine. There's no need for you to identify them to species level, unless it's something you're particularly interested in. And then 18.
Breadcrumb sponge.
Breadcrumb sponge, yes. Different to crumb of bread sponge. But yes, absolutely right. And 19. Anyone get this far? I want to give it a go on the hoof.
The flat periwinkle on barnacles.
Yeah, perfect. So this is Littorina obtusata, the flat periwinkle on barnacle spur. I think we call it. Last but not least, nice easy finish, hopefully.
Common sunstar.
Common sunstar, yeah, and a nice limpet tucked in the corner and some barnacles and stuff. So hopefully that felt relatively easy. I mean, that's 20 species from the off that you can identify. So even if you didn't think you were very good at seashores, clearly you are without even knowing it.
A bit easier than the seaweed.
Yes. I guess, you know, there's more diversity to our eyes in the animals. So, you know, it's once you've nailed it to a group, like, you know, this is a type of starfish, or, you know, it's a mollusk, you can break it down much easier. Where the seaweeds, because we're just so unused to identifying them, that kind of, you know, very much focusing on the branching and the cells and the colours, it is much harder. Which is why I would, you know, when you're starting out in these things, I would always suggest learn that the 4 or 5 rack seaweeds, the big ones that are habitat forming, then go with the animals, and then if you're interested, go back to the seaweeds. You know, I think it's very much about building up confidence in these things rather than trying to attack it all at once. It can be a bit overwhelming. I'm aware we're kind of at the end of time. Does anyone have any kind of questions or points or ideas, interesting things they found they'd like to share? I can't actually see you very well in this, so I'm going to take that as a no unless anyone jumps in, because I still can't see you very well. I will call it to a halt there, because I'm aware you've all got dinners and hopefully large glasses of wine, etc., to go to on a Wednesday night. I just want to say thank you again for taking, you know, a few hours out of your life to come and talk about this, to learn about this. I think it's all fascinating stuff. And again, I will put my email in the chat. So if you have any other questions, a couple of you got in touch already, please feel free to reach out. If you have any pictures you'd like to share or discuss identification with, please feel free to reach out. And I'd like to hand over to Maddie in case you want to talk about the other training that's coming up.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Hannah, for running these 2 sessions. I think everybody's found them really useful. So that's great to see. And yeah, depending on what happens with the project, maybe we can figure out some in-person things. I did send a comment through about the upcoming sessions, but I had a power cut, so I can't see it anymore, but hopefully everybody else can still see it. And I included the email address there as well, so if anybody wants to be added to the project mailing list, then you can just send me an email. The 2 sessions are on the 24th of February and the 3rd of March, so they'll be split up in 2 as well, just to make it a bit more manageable, I guess, and digestible, because it's a lot of information. I don't know if anybody has any other questions specifically for me or related to the project before we wrap up.
Andrew put a question about where do they find the recordings?
Oh, yeah, good question. So once I get them from Hannah, I'll get them uploaded onto the YouTube account and I'll send out a link. So what I normally do is share the link via email, so the project mailing list, but I can also include the website where all of the training links get added on the NatureScot website. If you give me a moment, and you can find the previous trainings that we've run on there as well.
Yeah, and I will make sure I get these kind of recorded and sent over tomorrow. So hopefully by next week they should all be available if you want to revise and take it out on the seashore.
I'll be on holiday next week, so I won't. But when I get back, I'll get to it here. So I'll just send through the link to the training webpage, and you can see it as well. Out of interest, Andrew, how did you hear about these sessions? Oh, I think you're on mute.
From Lucy at Coast on Isle of Arran.
All right, perfect. Well, maybe Lucy can circulate around the email.
Right, thanks.
Okay, perfect. If there's nothing else, then really appreciate it. Lovely to see you all. Thank you very much for your enthusiasm and your questions and your answers as well. And yeah, hopefully at some point we'll be able to see you on the shore.
Okay,
Have a lovely
thanks very
evening.
much indeed, Hannah. That's great.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
everybody. Thank
Bye.
you.
It's been
Bye.
really great.